People always ask me, did you know you were making a milestone film at the time? No, it was my first film, and to me that was a big enough milestone in and of itself. Then it became something that the underground students became interested in. They discovered Citizen Kane. They passed it around amongst themselves until it surfaced again in the early 50s. To me, it's like Hamlet. Every time I see it, I hear something and see something at another level than I didn't. And my goodness, I've seen it a dozen times, I'm sure now. And every time at the end, I just say, oh, you lucky, lucky, lucky person.
People often ask me to realize what we were getting at the time. You couldn't look at those dailies coming in every day and not realize you were getting something quite extraordinary. But I don't think any of us, Orson included, were thinking that we were making a film that was going to be thought of 50 years later as maybe the greatest film ever made. It's certainly one of the top few. I had been around the studio by this time 5 or 6 years and had been cutting some films, and good films too, but nothing had come through with the look and the feeling and the dynamics and the unusual aspects that this film had. This was completely extraordinary.
My experience in Citizen Kane was one of the highlights in my career. Working with Orson Welles was an experience, and I will say, and I've said this many times, that I look on him as one of the few geniuses that I've worked with. And by that I mean that the man had tremendous talent, and of course the picture is evidence of that. But knowing behind the scenes what went on and how he solved certain problems and how he got the acting out of his actors the way he did. But Citizen Kane is so unique that even today, any craft in this industry will study that picture, and I've known students that study it frame by frame. I had one of them once say to me, that shot with a parrot in the foreground. I see an image in that parrot's eye. Did you put it in? And I said, first place, I don't remember ever seeing that image in his eye, and second, I sure didn't do it. This is how attentive the students are to all the different aspects of that film.
The feeling of comradeship was so great. He, of course, was the director. He was the leader. We were literally disciples. But he was so kind. He loved actors. I mean, really loved actors. And because of that, you could do anything. He thought you could do it, you could do it. It's like playing over your head with a tennis partner that's better than you are. But if you were doing a scene, he would say, keep it rolling, Greg, and then he would say, now, Ruth, let's try it this way, a little more that way, and you do a few lines. And without stopping, and the terrible thing in front of your face where you get, the concentration is dissipated and all the noise in the set. And he would do it several different ways, or suggest it. He never gave you a line reading, but he would suggest a feeling or a motive or a little bit of a change. He was so kind, and I know that's not what people remember Orson for. He loved creativity, you see, and that was the thing. As long as you were creating, he was happy, you were happy, everybody was happy. And of course there were no brass around, no PA people, no publicity, nothing. Literally it was a closed set. Nobody interfered with us. We were a tight little family, and we could risk anything that way, anything. He was one of the most wonderful people I've ever known, if not the most wonderful.
I'm pretty sure the first time I met Wells, when I had asked Bob Wise to bring him over and into our department to show him the optical printer, he caught on pretty quickly and figured that here's a magic machine that I can just get anything I wanted. And he wouldn't say, can you do this anymore? He got to, so here's what I'd like. He was polite, he was nice enough. But he'd say, here, I'd like you to do this, I'd like you to do this. Well, now all I'd say, fine, I'll try it, see what I can do.
The picture was very well planned in its shooting. I had the kind of coverage I needed when I needed. If he had a scene that had quite a lot of dialogue.
Excuse me, but my landlady prefers me to keep this door open when I have a gentleman caller.
All right.
Let's say Miss Susan, she takes him into her apartment, and they have the dialogue on the couch there. Well, he shot that in a normal fashion, kind of a full shot, and a couple close to shot, and a couple over shoulders, close-ups, I recall. So it was a rather normal editing challenge and job. I suppose the two areas that I worked on the most with Mark Robeson, who was then my assistant, where it was more work, creative work was put into it than anything else, would be the whole opening, the March of Time.
News on the march!
particularly finding the stock film shots that we use, a lot of real stock films in there. That takes hours of looking and viewing, and then making the film that Orson shot to simulate newsreels of the time, making it look like it was part of that whole fabric of the real newsreel. We had to take our film and degrade it. Mark Robeson and I would be in our cutting room sometimes with the film running through cheesecloth on a rewind with sand and everything, scratch it up. Other people would come in our department and say, "What in the world are you guys doing?" The other sequence, I guess, that we spent the most time on, had the most input on, was the breakfast table scene, the deterioration of the marriage. Now, the concept and the shooting was all in the script, and Morrison shot it, but what was done in the editing room was the rhythm of the whole thing, the speed of the whip pans from one piece to the other, and where the dialogue would start in the whip pan or earlier in the incoming piece. That was Mark and I played with that sequence off and on for a period of weeks to get what finally became the version on the screen.
Harold, do you know how long you kept me waiting last night while you went to the newspaper for 10 minutes? What do you do in a newspaper in the middle of the night?
They didn't have any whips in the picture. They didn't shoot it that way. So I went out and shot the whips to cut them in. But you didn't just cut them in. In order to get a good easy start and an easy finish, I would take, say, the first frame that was going into the whip and make a whip frame or two on the optical printer that cut onto the other one. And how did I do it? I would shoot it with the shutter open and move the aperture over.
I asked him the last time we were interviewed together why he didn't give me any direction during our shooting of the breakfast scene. And he said, well, there wasn't any need to. You knew what you were doing. He said the problem was I was changing. My role was changing into a monster. And you were staying the same, which was not too good for the marriage. I should have grown a little more toward him, and he should have stopped growing so much into the greedy monster he became. But he said you didn't need any instructions. You just had your way to go, and you did it.
With one purpose only, to point out and make public the dishonesty, the downright villainy of boss Jim W. Getty's political machine.
In the scene where KANE is making a political speech, there's a shot there with Collins in the foreground, who is viewing this setup below, the seats and the stage, and Wells talking, and a big poster of Wells behind him. There are 3 exposures there to get that together. Collins in the foreground, shot entirely separately, and the people walking on the floor, and the rest of the scene, which is Wells on the stage.
He had no money, so he had to use his ingenuity, suggesting sets that didn't cost thousands and thousands of dollars. In Madison Square Garden, there was only one row in the high balcony where I sat with our son. Those effects Orson used, never cheating, they were just imaginative.
Now I can afford to make some promises.
The first time I saw Greg Toland, who was a cinematographer and who literally created lenses to be able to do the things that technically Orson asked for from an artistic standpoint, the two of them were on the set. I was coming down in costume to do the test, and I guess I should have been surprised that the leading man was actually there to test with me. I didn't know that that was an unusual sort of thing. They were on their hands and knees on the floor with a hatchet, literally hacking out the wooden floor and then digging out with dirt beneath it so that they could put the camera not just at floor level, which would then make, this lens would still be here. It wouldn't be absolutely there. They kind of buried it like you would in the sand so that the lens was actually right at the floor level. Orson had a great feeling that the proportion and distance and angles between people told the whole story. He said you should be able to see the film without one word of dialogue and understand at least the relationships between the people.
Orson's such a magnificent talent in staging scenes.
Mr. Carter, is this your office, Mr. Carter?
The one scene in particular that I ever remember is when Orson and Joe Cotton and Bernstein come to take over the newspaper the first time. They go in to meet Erskine Sanford, who's the editor. And that whole scene with Urson so up in the air and going around and turning around, and the guys are coming in with things and rugs and cartons, and the whole scene is played with kind of all the guys circling, Sandra circling and Orson circling, the guys coming through on the rug and thing. And it was just the timing and relationship of all the action and activity and the way he had Urson played it, I thought was just a beautifully, beautifully done scene.
Excuse me? That's right, Mr.
Excuse me?
Excuse me?
It was Toland's marvelously fluid camera and great lighting.
Orson did not mean this to be a biography of Hearst. And that's the honest truth, I know that. But when Mankiewicz came in to help with some of the rewriting, Mankiewicz suggested that they use Saint-Simeon as a background. Orson had not been there, but he had many times, and he said, it's so perfect for the image of this great man who gets so carried away with himself.
Like the pharaohs, Xanadu's landlord leaves many stones to mark his grave. Since the pyramids, Xanadu is the costliest monument a man has built to himself.
So that, of course, made everybody feel that it was Hearst he was talking about.
My thought is it is very much about Hearst, very much. It has to be with Xanadu, Saint-Simeon, the newspaper, first thing, the buying of all the artifacts, you know, and the antiques and things. I mean, it's the wife, mistress, it's Hearst. No question about it. I had a need for Orson to come in and redo a few lines in the film, to loop them, as we call it, to replace the dialogue. And for some reason or other, I had a dickens of a time getting him into the looping room to do this. I was running out of time, I almost had to literally take him and push him into the looping room and lock the door and make him do it. And of course, once he got started, he was just masterful at it, just did it beautifully. And so from there on, when I did Ambresses with him later, the soundtrack was not important to him. The dialogue, the real track that we picked up on the set was important. If an airplane went over, well, we'll loop it later. If there was a creak on the floor from a train shot or something, well, that's all right, don't worry, it's a good take, we'll loop that later. He went just the other way, from the man who didn't want to loop anything and the man who would loop the whole picture if he felt like it.
Well, what do you think of the chances for war in Europe?
I've talked with the responsible leaders, the great powers, England, France, Germany, and Italy. They're too intelligent to embark on a project which would mean the end of civilization as we now know it. You can take my word for it. There'll be no war.
After we got it finished, and I got a sudden call from my boss, Jimmy Wilkinson, head of the department, saying, Bob, we have a request from New York, a very strong one. They need to get a print of Kane back to New York right away. The whole purpose was to show this print of the film to the heads of all the companies and their lawyers to see whether they would say, as a result of this showing of viewing the film, say to RKO, listen, in the interest of our industry, you better just put this film on the shelf and not release it. We ran the film for these people and their lawyers, and they got up afterwards and thanked me. And the next day I got a list of what they felt were things that should be changed in the film to make it something that would be less of a problem vis-a-vis Hearst, which is what this was all about, of course, you know. There was nothing of any great nature there. Changed a few newspapers to change headline names and dates. After 6 weeks of this back and forth, having done all this, I ran the picture again for just the lawyers this time, and the result was they went ahead and let them release the film. But that was what it was about. They might have stopped them, but at least at that time, from releasing it.
There were lawsuits poised and many other things, but I do remember that in the Hearst newspapers, he would naturally have to advertise the picture. They paid for an ad, and it was going to be in the newspaper. But he didn't want to. They didn't want to mention the name of the picture. And I can recall, and there must be copies around somewhere, that whenever it was Citizen Kane, they would say, that certain picture.
It was not helped any by the fact that the Hearst papers wouldn't advertise it as such, you know, box office-wise. I think it was a disappointment to the studio, and I'm sure, however, over the years, with the number of reissues it's had and all, that it's paid off more, but it was not accepted general audience in the kind of numbers that one would like to have had. I don't think they appreciated the mass audience or the fine aspects of the film.
Orson told me the story of what the the theme of Citizen Kane was when our first meeting. He said it's about what Americans praise and feel are the worthy heroes of their times. Actually, they are the despoilers of America. Their greed is going to ruin America. It's going to bring us to the edge of total oblivion. Orson was a very philosophical person, and actually a spiritual person. People don't think of him in that way either. He loved the Bible. He said if anybody knows the Bible, really learns it, not just reads it here and there, and Shakespeare, that's all you have to know in life. You don't have to have any other education. You have all the facts and all the nuances you need, and then if you will live according to that, you'll be all right.
But having been around, having worked on the film, having exposed to Orson and all the way through, I tell you, his stamp is so strong on every frame of that film that it's kind of pointless to say who should get the greatest credit. It's Orson's film from beginning to end, no question in my mind. Oh, I suppose it's affected me. It was a fascinating experience because I think, without question, Orson is as close to a genius as anybody I've come across in the business. He was fascinating, stimulating, aggravating. Things were never for very long on an even keel, it seemed to me, on the pictures. He could be guilty at one moment of such an outrageous piece of behavior, you want to tell him to shove the picture and walk off, but before you could do anything like that, he'd have an idea that was so brilliant it'd have your mouth gaping open. What I've learned from him is to try to keep my films as dynamic and as strong as I can, to try to hook the audience as early on as I can with the picture and never let them go if possible. I think I've learned that as much from Orson as anything else.
His excesses came from an excess of passionate longing to do the work that he loved to do. He would say to us, always examine yourself. See what is your heart's desire. That's what you were created to do and to be. Now, this was long before examine yourself, do your own thing, find out what you are to do. We were always harassed by people who said, no, don't go into that. There's not enough money in it, or there's not enough security in it, or artists were looked on as kind of queer ducks, and you would never be a part of real society. And he did me a tremendous favor by that, because I discovered while I was doing Citizen Kane, I was pregnant with my first child. As well as doing my first production on film, I was producing my first child. I knew I was going to get flack. Retire. This is for children to play act. Take care of your family. And he said, no, creativity is your number one thing to do on earth. And that's been my byword ever since.